I wanted to actually start with the concept of heightened scrutiny. Chase, can you explain for people who are not like me and avid listeners of the 5 to 4 podcast what that means in the law? And then, Sam, I would be interested to hear you explain what it means to you sort of as a concept in the culture that made sense for the title of the film.
So in constitutional law, when you're a marginalized group, what you're asking the court for is heightened scrutiny. You want the court to shift the scrutiny from the oppressed group to the government, and that means that you have a better likelihood of succeeding when you bring a constitutional challenge to government discrimination. And it is really the centerpiece of the work that Thurgood Marshall did, that Justice Ginsburg did, and then that we are trying to advocate for trans people right now in the courts.
I think, it really resonated with me for the title of the film because it encompasses this idea of what Chase is trying to do in the film, the work they're working towards, but also the ways in which the media has scrutinized trans people in particular so intensely. So just that flip of the idea of the word just really lends itself to the issues we're discussing.
Much of the film is a really sharp critique of mainstream center-left media outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic, not right-wing outlets like Fox News, and how they have shaped the conversation around trans identity, specifically around gender-affirming care. I wanted to sort of like flip the script and ask, what media outlets do you trust to report on trans identity? And kind of more generally, like, what would a pro-trans media environment look like to you in your sort of wildest dreams?
I think there's so many different components to that, and I would say I come to this with a broader critique of media generally, and one of the things that I've been really distressed about over the last few years, especially as someone who does legislative advocacy in state houses and litigates in the court, is the demolition of local media. That we don't have people on the ground who understand the idiosyncrasies of local political contexts. And then that in turn creates a distance between what is happening and how people's lives are experiencing the law. And so what I look for in media is a connection to context, an ability to understand and position a story, breaking news story within a broader context. And one of the main critiques I have of coverage of trans people is it totally divorced from context. It's divorced from the humanity of trans life and instead is framed around ideological overlays that allow transness to be debated instead of putting into perspective why we're seeing things, what is the historical antecedent to that, and then how can we resist it.
I think about two things when you ask that question. I think one, no one should trust any singular source. Like, we should all be looking at many sources and forming our own opinion based on those sources. But I also think about how no general narrative about a population will ever shift until someone who has a stake in that narrative is in a position of power. So that's the change we need to see.
I wanted to ask about sort of how Hollywood sort of factors into this, or maybe more broadly, like mainstream popular culture as opposed to media and journalism, because you have figures like Laverne Cox and Elliot Page in the film, but there isn't a really detailed discussion of pop culture representation. Was that a conscious choice that you made, Sam, to sort of leave that to other documentaries? But I did also kind of want to get your take, since you're here, about how Hollywood is doing on this topic right now.
It's a great question. 5 years ago today, I think this actual day, we premiered a film called Disclosure, and that looked at that exact question. And part of the reason we made that film was because of this increase we were seeing in the visibility of trans people was really coinciding with an increase of legislative and social violence. And I was terrified about what the larger picture would look like. And clearly we had no idea how bad it would be. But that film was about this, kind of warning us about this moment that we thought would come. And that film wanted to look at the history of trans representation in order for people to understand how they had learned about trans people, how we had learned about ourselves. And, so I did it there, right? I looked at it there because that was where people were focused at the time. I personally had stopped watching all that film and TV representation of trans people because it was so offensive. And so I had to kind of dig back into that history to tell that story. Similarly with this film, I've moved away from mainstream media in general. Like even the best coverage, I think, is really problematic of trans people. So this film picks up where Disclosure left off. That being said, it's no trans person has to be an advocate or an activist, but at this moment in time, it sort of goes hand in hand. Just walking through the street, just your body in public space, you are an activist, advocate, just being there. And so people like Laverne and Elliot can't avoid these topics, and they're very important to them, and they use their codia to speak about these topics. So, I mean, they're part of our lives. Laverne and I are really close. Elliot and Chase are really close. Laverne and Chase are really close. Peppermint was also in the film, and she also marries her advocacy with her art. So for a lot of us, you can't really tease them out. And so it's important for us all to be part of these conversations at the same time.
I think the other thing that, these are our friends, and one of the things that was really important to me was protecting the people in my life from the violence that I experienced just by virtue of being an advocate for trans life. And so we were really deliberate about when we're showing my personal life, we're showing my life alongside people who have already put themselves out there in the public domain, people who already understand how to navigate that type of, sort of cruelty, death threats, and other things. And so that's another reason why you see people who already have a higher profile, because those are the people who understand what it means to put yourself out there as a trans person in public life in 2025.
Out of curiosity, have you seen Anelia Perez?
No. Yes.
Thoughts?
I wish they had watched Disclosure.
Fair enough. I wanted to dig into the recent news about Trump's issuing an executive order that, quote, recognizes two sexes, male and female, unquote. I was kind of wanted your expertise, Chase, to explain even to me and also our readers and viewers, like, what does this executive order actually do, sort of in the immediate term, and what will the fight against it look like legally?
Yeah, so on the night of inauguration, on January 20th, Trump issued many executive orders. One of those was an executive order that I would call an anti-trans executive order. It has sweeping efforts to restrict access to legal protections for trans people by directing many federal agencies to adopt policies that restrict the ability of trans people to access public space, access identification, potentially access healthcare. Now, on its own, the executive order does not accomplish those things, but it does tell many agencies to do something. I think the most immediate effects that we're going to see and have already started to see are the prospective denial of passports and other federal identification that allows trans people to have a sex marker that matches who they are. Every trans person I know is panicked about this. We are only able to move safely and freely through the world when we have identification that matches how people see us and how we see ourselves. And that was immediate because the State Department was able to make a change quickly, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio had already been confirmed. And so we are already seeing people losing access to passports and other federal identification, potentially. We are also seeing trans people in prisons who have been in women's prisons, trans women, being forced into segregation and imminently transferred into men's prisons. These are people who have never been in a men's facility. And when the federal government has recognized for 20 years that trans people are some of the most vulnerable people to sexual violence in custody, these are just the very beginnings of what we are seeing as a result of the executive order. There are lots of concerns about the ways in which the order will be used to restrict people's access to healthcare for both trans adolescents and trans adults. The legal fight against all of these federal government actions is going to be intimately tied to the legal fight that we already have up at the Supreme Court in the United States versus Scrumeti, because the question is whether or not the government can target trans people for discrimination and whether or not heightened scrutiny will apply to that discrimination. So the outcome of the case at the center of the film will be one of our central tools for fighting back against the Trump administration's actions targeting the trans community. The other thing I'll flag is this morning it was announced that today Trump is going to ban trans service members from the military. So that is 18,000 people who are actively serving, potentially losing access to their benefits that they spent most of their adult lives, counting on.
Looking beyond Scrumeti, and I'd say that because we won't know what the decision is until long after this interview drops. I'm curious if there are any cases coming up in this like circuit courts that you're looking at as being, something to keep an eye on that might get to the Supreme Court in the future?
With all of the executive orders coming down from President Trump, I think we're going to see a lot of them going up to the challenges going up to the Supreme Court very swiftly. And that's, the birthright citizenship order, several of the immigration orders. I imagine many of the challenges to the anti-trans aspect of these orders will also go up to the court quickly. So people should be mindful of that. The court also announced that they are going to hear this term a case in which parents have opted out of allowing their kids to have access to LGBT material in school based on religious exemption free exercise grounds. Those types of cases obviously have a huge impact on what can be taught in schools, how trans people and other students can learn about trans life. So all of these things are percolating in the lower courts. There are also cert petitions pending, so questions already waiting right there at the court around whether or not trans people can play sports with their peers. And then I think we're going to see a lot of challenges around restroom access are also going up. So this is going to be a 5-year period of very intense litigation up at the Supreme Court over trans life.
Looking beyond the legal conversation, Sam, one of my favorite interviews that you include in the film is with Lydia Polgreen. And the conversation sort of goes to the centrality of a nostalgic view of gender in the march of right-wing authoritarianism, dating back decades. I'm curious if after making this film and Disclosure, if you have a sense of what the playbook is for fighting that. What is the sort of to push the culture and politics in the opposite direction, to diffuse the power of that sort of right-wing movement? What would that look like?
I think my job is more about asking the questions, right? And encouraging the public to ask the questions. And that's more where my brain goes. This guy can tell you more about the playbook. So if you feel like you have an answer to that, no pressure.
I have so many answers. Well, I mean, I do think it is partly asking the question. It's being critical thinkers about what's happening. I do think learning about the way in which the imposition by governments of regressive notions of gender is used to build authoritarian power is essential for people to collectively push back on anti-trans rhetoric and policy, because this is being used as a way to consolidate the power of the government to control not only the access to trans people's bodies and healthcare, but access to family formation through restrictions on contraception and abortion, the ability to control who and can form a family and how. This is a way that the government controls its citizens. And if we are going to turn our heads from this while trans people are under assault, before we know it, we're going to have a lot fewer rights and a lot less access to bodily autonomy. And you can look at authoritarian regimes around the world over the last century and see exactly the role gender played. And so transness is a site of controlling conversations about gender, but it is not just about trans people. It's about all of us.
That's why I put the camera on him.
I think a lot of people who don't have, say, like advanced legal training sometimes feel like, well, what can I do in this moment? What would be your advice for like an action item for someone who cares deeply about the safety of trans people and the freedom of trans people, but isn't going to be arguing before the Supreme Court?
Our creative interventions, our cultural interventions have more power over law and policy than our legal arguments do. The judges, legislators, justices exist in the same cultural climate that we all do. And so the way to defend trans life and build bodily autonomy for everyone is to shift the cultural narrative. It's to disrupt those reductive ways of framing trans people so that when the Supreme Court or the Tennessee legislature starts debating our life, there's a different cultural context in which that is playing out. That is how we all change this world moving forward. And that's for that's how we talk about trans people. That's how we talk about immigrants. That's how we talk about all people of color. This is essential to changing the legal world that we live in.